of page Mem He. And there's 2 dots, if you'll see, and then we're going to start kind of a new, like a continuation of what we said yesterday, or just now, in our review. Okay, Va'olam Idvarav. So what comes out from these last words of the Abarbanel, who came to explain and justify the Rambam against Rabbi Chizdai, right? Where Rabbi Chizdai was saying it's illogical to think that faith is a mitzvah, because you have to already assume there's a God in order to accept this mitzvah. And then he defends the Rambam, right? The Rambam doesn't defend himself. He defends the Rambam by saying that the mitzvah is actually not to believe that there is a God, but that he is mechoyev metzias, that the God that we already know is there, his existence is essentially different because he has to be there, as opposed to everything else which its existence is dependent on something else. So, ha'olam idvarav, what comes out of his words, shatzivoy ha'amana, that the commandment to believe, eina al metzias hakel, it's not that to believe that God exists. Ki al zeh lo nitzarech letzivoy, because based for this, everyone agrees. All those masters that we've been talking about, and we, because it doesn't make any logical sense, we all agree that you don't need a commandment to believe that God exists. Ki kavar yadanu shu nimtza. We already know that he exists. It's like a foregone conclusion. Kamoshi yisbar. And you asked a good question. Does really every child, everyone knows God exists? He says yes, and we'll explain. He says we'll explain that a little bit later. Rak hatzivoy hu haamana shemitziusu hu hayoser shalim. So what is the commandment to believe in God? It's to believe that this God that we know he already exists is that his existence is the most whole of all other existences that are out there, right? The existence of things. Amna ma shebira chacham anizkar inyan shleimus mitziuso shumachoyev hametzius. So, however, says the Tzemach Tzedek, this that the chacham, which I believe he's talking about the Abarbanel here, explains that the notion of his existence being whole, like in other words, the most shalim, the most whole existence, right? And that means that he's quote unquote mechoyev hametzias, that means that he must be, as opposed to everything else that just could be, right? That's how we explained that. Hine alpi derech hakabbalah hu be'inyan acher. So Kamoshi Yisbar, he says the truth is that he tried to justify the Rambam, right, by saying that what the Rambam means is really that he's the God we already know about, is his existence is whole, and that he must be. But he says we're going to explain it a different way than he did. We're going to justify the Rambam slightly different way than the Abarbanel did, because basically al pi Kabbalah it comes out a little bit differently. Kamoshi Yisbar lefanenu im yirtzeh Hashem, as we will presently explain before us with God's help. Ki Gam al hayosu mechoyev metzius, and why do we need to explain in another way? Why is the Abarbanel's explanation not sufficient for the Tzemach Tzedek? Because even this, that God's existence is a necessity, also for this ein tzrich le'emunah. He wants to say you also don't need faith for that. In other words, you don't need to be commanded, just like you know that God exists, and there's no justification to command a person that. You also know that God's existence is mechoyev b'metzias, that he is an essential being, that nothing else can be like him. In other words, that's also something that is a foregone conclusion and doesn't need to be commanded. Because that's part of the knowledge that we already know. So in other words, we didn't really get ourselves out of hot water. The challenge of Rebbe Chizdai, according to the Tzemach Tzedek, is like still sitting on our shoulders, because the explanation that the Abarbanel gave to get us out of that, he wants to say that's not really sufficient, because we also not only know that there's a God already, but we know that this God is mechoyev metzias, that he must be, that his existence is the most whole, and that he, unlike everything else, which is dependent on something, on him, he's not dependent on anything. Right? It's nichlal bichlal hagidiyah shekavar yadanu. It's included in this knowledge that we already know. Sheyesh bora hamachaya olam. And what do we already know? That there's a creator who enlivens the world. And because if you already know that there's a God, and you know that this God is responsible for everything, then it's a foregone conclusion that his existence must be essential. And this is something that, in fact, if you look into the Abarbanel himself, he explains what the concept of his existence being necessary. Shuzeh, that basically, what does it mean that he's necessary is that everything's dependent on him because he creates the world. So that's really not going to cut it either in terms of a resolution of this illogical loop. Ella, so how do we explain? So here the Tzemach is going to give us, like, so to speak, the answer al pi Kabbalah, al pi Chassidus. Ella ha'amuna hi shehu yisbarach ram v'nizgav l'mayla medrekas ha'chochma. What is the belief in God then that we're commanded in? Is to believe that Hashem, blessed be He, is exalted and elevated. L'mayla, it's like just like a concept of just way beyond the level of chokhmah. That's it, right? We're intended to believe that God is incomprehensible. That's the mitzvah, to believe in God, right? You already know that He exists, but now you're commanded to believe, because you can't really know this in the normal way, because what you're commanded to believe is that the God that you know that exists is unknowable. He's beyond the concept of knowledge. He's not, so to speak, dressed in a category which you can put your dirty mind on, right? In other words, like, it's not graspable.
Is that when you've said previously in other moments when you've talked about how the randomness of like things occurring, it's like, you know, you ask for help and you get the help in the most strangest way. Someone like, you know, you need help with money, and then someone who owed you money from like 17 years ago bumps into you the next day and goes, oh, by the way, here's the money that I owe you. And you're like, there's no way that you could have predicted it. It's completely, it seems from the outset like completely random. It's like the way that Hashem works is incomprehensible, in the same way that like we know the judgments of heaven by the responses that we get, but we don't know what the calculation is. We don't know what.
I would actually say no to the end, if that's not what it means. Why? Because you're still dealing, when you're talking about it, with the justice system.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that we don't really understand how Hashem's justice system works, but we know that He has a justice system, right? What we're talking about is something much more profound than that. That the fact you can say Hashem has a justice system is already a logical understanding of God, that He works in such and such a way. Now, okay, of course, He's not human, so His logic would, but you'll say, okay, even that we can put our dirty minds on. I'm saying in the kind of a funny way, because like, say, don't put your dirty hands on this, like, you have no business touching this, right? So your mind has no business touching God, which means even this I can explain, okay, maybe in this lifetime, you know, you don't understand why you got this money, but it was because of a previous lifetime. So it makes sense. In other words, it's explainable, even if you don't quite get it. We're talking about something that it's not explainable, because just like the way the Alter Rebbe puts it in Tanya, just like your hands cannot hold an idea, and anyone who, if you try to say that to anyone, they would laugh at you, right? Because ideas are not graspable with the coarse materialism of your hands. So too, God is not graspable with your mind. Not because He's so complicated that your mind can't figure Him out, which is kind of what you're saying. He's just like He is something knowable. It's just I can't know Him. No, what we're saying is your mind is like hands. You try and put your mind on God, it's laughable, because He is in a dimension where mind does not touch there, and it's not able to grasp God. That's the mitzvah to believe.
So we don't have the resource or the ability of mind to even come close to understanding or comprehending even a sliver of what Hashem really is.
That's right. And so, but here's the beauty of it. We don't have the ability to comprehend it with intelligence, and I'm kind of giving away the whole mimer here, 30 pages of a mimer. It really comes down to this. Yeah. We don't have the power of intelligence, but we do have the power of emunah, which means there's like a koach that we do have, so to speak, which holds God. It's not mind. It's not with your intelligence. It's with your belief. And therefore, we have a mitzvah to believe, because that's basically how you interact with God at the level of His true self, not with intellect. You can't know Him in that way, but you can believe in Him, and there's your access. And therefore, you're commanded to believe in Him, because that's your access point to basically relating with God in the nature of His true self.
Yeah.
You're done, huh?
What sfira does that come with? Chokhmah? Like which one is really?
No, Kesser. It would be Amuna then, because Chokhmah is mind. So we're saying specifically not Chokhmah, right? Chokhmah, there's no business trying to hold God. Like your hands can't hold an idea, your mind cannot hold God. But what can you hold him with? Belief. Right? So that's like the Kesser. And that's why you're commanded to believe in him.
Is it like holding a kiddush cup? Is it a resemblance?
I'm saying like holding a kiddush cup means the thing you're holding has edges, and therefore it's graspable. And therefore ideas also could have edges, right? For example, like there could be an idea that you just simply don't understand, or you can have an idea that you find its edges, and therefore your mind can hold it like a kiddush cup. So that's how you hold something with your mind, right? With graspable. What we're saying is God cannot be grasped by the mind, and really nothing can grasp him in that way. The only thing that can grasp him is your belief in him, and that's why there's a special mitzvah. In fact, it's the first mitzvah that God gave us. It's the most primary mitzvah. There's something incredible. That's why we're going to sit here for like the next 30 pages, which could be at least 30 days, if not more. And Mamish, think about this, because it is the most profound, foundation of everything that we do. And we have to put our minds on it every once in a while. It's really something amazing. Wow. Okay, so anyway, moving right along, what does the Tzemach Tzedek say? How do we justify? Again, we want to say that believing in God is illogical. To command a person to believe in God is illogical, says Rabbi Chizdoi. Our Barbanel comes back and says, no, it's not to believe that he's there, it's to believe that he's whole and that he's the essential existence. Comes the Tzemach Tzedek and says, that's also illogical, because my knowledge of him, that he's already there, also incorporates the fact that he's whole and he's the essential existence. So therefore, I'm back to the same problem. What does it mean to believe in him? And he says, it means to believe that God is beyond knowledge, he's beyond chokhmah, and that he is exalted beyond chokhmah. Right? Stay with me over there. As it says, as the Tzemach Tzedek says, as I already wrote in the mitzvah of Nidarim, in other words, this is a book called Sefer HaMitzvahs, or Derech Mitzvosecha, Taimei HaMitzvahs. He already explained something of this concept in a previous mitzvahs, what he's trying to say. ובכלל זה שהוא יסברך מחייס העולם, באופן שהם בטלים במציאות לגמרי, לגבי דבר השם ברוח פיו יסברך. Right, and basically what he's saying, what did he explain over there? That inside of this knowledge, or I can't really call it knowledge, but this belief that God is, so to speak, exalted above all of the things, with this goes this idea, which is that Hashem enlivens the world in such a way that the world is betelim b'metzias, right? That if you believe that God is completely beyond chokhmah, which is beyond grasp, then what is the world, which that's inside of this infinite God? It's in a state of bittul b'metzias, right? That together with the fact that you're believing in this level of exaltedness, it's God is beyond grasp, like you said, not like the Kiddush cup. It's ungraspable. Therefore, anything which would be finite and thus graspable in the presence of that infinite God would be batul b'metzias. Its existence would be in a state of negation, completely. Right? Legabi dvar Hashem v'ruach piv yisbarach kebitul or hashemesh b'shemesh. Just like the bittul of the light of the sun inside the sun. Right? So this is like the famous classic example. If you're going to believe that, the world is some kind of a expression of God, then you have to know that just like the sun ray that comes outside of the sun, it has a position also inside the sun. Right? And when it's inside the sun, before the ray basically shines out, right, and you see rays, so if there's a ray that can shine all the way from the sun to this world, then obviously that ray also can be inside of its source. And when it's inside of its source, you don't call it a ray anymore, says the Alter Rebbe, right, in the famous Mashal Netanya. It's just called the sun, because when something is something is inside of its source, it doesn't get the name ray. It only gets the name ray when it's shining outside and basically exited its source.
You mean the core? The
core, right? Again, this analogy, I don't want to confuse everybody more than this is already a confusing mimer, but in fact, I won't. Let's just leave it at that. One could ask scientifically, whatever. I had a whole amazing debate about this with. I won't. I'm not going to go there. After class, if someone wants to get into a side parenthetical conversation, we can talk about it. But in the meantime, let's just keep ourselves simple, right? You see a ray of the sun. It's so to speak one ray, which is coming from the sun itself all the way through your window. If it reaches this far, right? Obviously, it's also found somewhere in its source, right? And even in a stronger way, and it's even inside the source. If it comes out of the sun, certainly it starts inside the sun. But when it's inside the sun, you do not call it by an independent name. It's not there. It's just the sun, the core. In which case, we're saying that creation is the same thing. If your belief in God is that He is exalted beyond grasp, then that automatically comes with the idea that any finite thing is in a state of negation inside of Him. Because unlike the sun, creation never actually does come out of Hashem, right? There is no outside of Hashem. He's everywhere. And His infiniteness is everywhere. In which case, any notion of what you think is a finite world, i.e. a ray coming out, is in fact presently inside of its source, and therefore is in fact presently negated out of its existence, just like the ray inside of the sun. Does that make sense? Okay. So it comes together with this idea. Kamosh Nizbar Mitzvah Yud, as the Tzemach Tzedek also spoke about this in the previous mitzvah. Ella sheyesh lomar she'emunah zu nichlal b'mitzvahs Haamanas Elokus. Okay, further complications, but this belief seemingly is more involved in the mitzvah of what we call believing in the unity of Hashem, right? Meaning to say that what we just spoke about is that's why, remember, the Zohar kind of like paired these mitzvahs together. Remember, the Zohar said there's a mitzvah in general, and there's a mitzvah in specific, right? And the Zohar actually learned, we sort of skipped this in our little introduction this morning, but the Zohar learned these two mitzvahs from two different verses than are the standard in the Rambam. Just a little quiz, right? Rambam learned them from the mitzvah of believing in God is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and the mitzvah of Yichud is what? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The Zohar learned that the same two mitzvahs, but from two different psukim. V'daita ki ani Hashem Elokechem, and Hashem Hu Elokim. But nonetheless, we see that one is like an expression of the other, and you can see why now, right? Because once your belief is characterized properly, that it's like you believe that the God is infinite, essentially, is beyond grasp, then it automatically goes with that to a certain degree, like a detail, which is that the world, which is finite, is completely negated inside of Him. And so for the yichud, which is the unification of the world with God, is sort of an automatic next mitzvah and next step, right? And so he says that, now we could say that this belief is really included in the belief in the yichud and the unification of Hashem and the world. Ubezeh yitachin deluchora kasha shagam ala yichud eino nitztarech litzivoy klal ki memela musag, and then you could say, if that's the case, we have another question, which is why is there a second mitzvah to believe in Hashem's unity? Because once you already believe that He is infinite, seemingly it's a logical conclusion that the world is negated inside of Him, and you would not need to be commanded on that. Like in other words, it brings up like a second issue. He says, once you realize that the belief in God means that He is infinite and He's exalted above any grasp, it automatically seemingly comes with the realization that the world is batel for the reason that we just explained excitedly, right? In which case it could bring another question. This is parenthetical. He doesn't want to like get us too lost on this. It could bring another question, that why would I need to have a commandment to believe, therefore, that the world is batel, if it's a foregone conclusion from my new understanding that God is infinite, right? And by the way, this is why Reb Chizdoi, just like he says believing in God is not a mitzvah, he also believes believing in the yichud of Hashem is not a mitzvah, because once you basically believe that this God is there, then it kind of goes without saying that there's nothing else but Him and everything is united with Him, right? And so, okay, that may be a question, and we'll get to that. But the point is, and he ends the parentheses here, so we don't want to get too off the track, is that we've concluded our assessment of what the belief in Hashem is, right? That it means to believe that the God that you already know is there, and that you already know is mechoyev b'metzias, which means you know He's the essential being. That's not the commandment. That God is completely infinite and beyond any grasp. Okay? And okay. With me? Okay. After the parentheses, v'inyan zeh hu hanikra b'zohar soviv kolom. All right, so we're going to kind of consolidate some of our terminology here. This level that we've just sort of hatched, this infinite level of God, is what the Zohar calls what? Sovev kolomi, which I'm sure we've heard this term before. It basically means the God which is not filling the worlds, but rather surrounding the worlds. That's also a misleading statement when you say God surrounds the worlds, because if you say God surrounds the worlds and you picture that like pictorially or like geometrically, so you're in the same position where you're making a big mistake, because you're saying Hashem is still like sort of taking up space. It's just instead of being in the space, He's around the space. That's not what it means to be Sovev Kolomim. What does it actually mean to be Sovev Kolomim?
That He gives it life force, but without taking it into account.
Okay.
Without,
in general, it means that, yeah, I would say that that's pretty good. It's the idea that it is, when you say it surrounds, it does not mean spatially surrounds, because that's also putting a limitation on Hashem. It means like it surrounds in the level, which means that it's like we were saying before. It's not graspable, and it's essentially in a state beyond containment. So you say something is like sovev to you, you would say like the mind of a super genius Rebbe Tzaddik, what he's thinking about, again, you don't have the capacity to even think such thoughts. That's what it means, surrounds you. It means it's beyond the consciousness of what anything inside of the world can ever get its hands on. It's like beyond the world. So that's what we're talking about. Sovev kolomi, that's what it actually means. That's what it means to surround the world. It means to be beyond the consciousness of the world entirely. And what we're really believing in is sovev. That's basically what the commandment is. To make it very simple, to believe in God, the mitzvah, is basically to believe in this level called sovev.
Sovev is to spin.
Sovev means to spin, but why does it mean to spin? Because it means around. The word sovev actually means to go around. Like listovev, to like spit, go around, right?
Like the sun and the moon going around, or is...
Yeah, also just to go around, like in circles, right? And why is the sovev called circles? Because unlike a straight line, where you can like see that it has a beginning and an end, you can sort of wrap your mind around it. When something has a beginning and an end, it's finite. The circle is the shape used to explain that which is beyond comprehension, because it has no beginning and no end. A circle, you can't find its beginning and an end. Any point can be the beginning. It has no beginning and end. So the idea that something has no beginning and end, something that does have beginning and end, can't grasp that, right? Like, in other words, God, who has no beginning and no end, He's completely, that level of reality is so completely beyond us. It's called...
We're not made that way.
Exactly. We can't grasp and internalize such a thing at all. It's completely beyond us. And that's the belief in God that you're supposed to have. That's what you're commanded to believe. Not that He's there, but that the He that's there is called sovev kolomi. It's completely beyond comprehension, and it is ungraspable in any way. Right? So al zeh hi mitzvah hamuna aval bechinas mamali kolomi. But when it comes to this sort of other notion of godliness, which is how that sovev contracts itself and goes out of the circle dimension to become a line, a linear concept, which is called the hishtalshelus, where he basically contracts himself and makes himself into a finite, understandable, graspable God, which we call the God who fills the worlds. The very fact that you could have a cup, a table, a person, a chair, a tree, that has its own form and shape, means that there's a soul which is enlivening a body, which means the soul accepts the limitations of that body, and therefore it can be contained. So that shows that God is basically putting certain limitations on Himself in order to make Himself expressible and knowable to us. And that's called the level Mimale Kolomim, He who fills the worlds, as opposed to He who surrounds the worlds. And on Mimale Kolomim, Eino Nofel Azel Lashon Amuna, it does not go with the word belief, because you not have to have belief on the level of God who fills the worlds. Ela kamoshe kasuv umbibsari echze eloka. Rather, what is our relationship with the mamale light of God? It's not a relationship of belief. We're not commanded to believe in such a thing, but rather, based on the pasuk in Eov, it says, quote, "From my flesh I see God." See, not believe, but you can see it practically with your eyes. And why does it say from my flesh? Because just like a metaphor, as we're going to soon see, just like a metaphor of your body and your own body and soul, from your own flesh, that you can see that there's a soul inside your body, so too you can practically see God when you're talking about the soul of the world, right? As we're going to presently explain. And echze mamish, in other words, you can literally see, not believe, see, right? You can see. V'utargum shel re'iyah. Now, what does it mean? From my flesh I see God, and why is the word for sight there not re'iyah? The word for sight in Hebrew is usually lirot. Why are we saying echze? Like a choseh? It's actually a translation of the word to see in Hebrew, right? And that's not accidental. Why is it not sight but translation of the word sight? V'gam she'eino roeh b're'iyah gashmius mamish, because you don't actually see God with your physical eye, right? So therefore, it's a translation of the words. It's like you see, but it's not actual sight. So that's why Eov, when he's explaining this, he says, "From my flesh I see," with a translation of the word for sight, not the actual word for sight, because he's saying it's something like sight, right? Because it's not seeing with the actual eyes of the fleshy eyes. Mekom, nevertheless, it's literally like you see him, right? And how is that? We basically sort of explained it already, but this notion that Hashem is enlivening all the worlds, it's like it's almost as though you can see that. This is why there's no commandment to believe this, because you wouldn't command someone to believe something which is obvious to them. For such a thing, belief is not required. It's called knowledge.
And yet we live in a time when most people don't even believe that there is Chas v'Shalom, like they don't even believe that there is a God.
Again,
they can see. You can go on YouTube and you can watch a time lapse of a seed being planted in a pot and a tree growing and bearing fruit, and people just go like, "Oh yeah, that's just normal." Like,
okay, because essentially, but again, there's certain things that, like, in other words, you have to bring this proof to them that he's about to bring. And then it's not so much of it's a proof. Then they have to decide what it is that you just proved to them. But let's see it inside for a second. Let me finish the idea, and then we'll return to the fact of what it means that people really what it means they say they don't believe in God. Because quite frankly, it could very well be that they're more aligned with the truth than you think they are. Because the idea of what we're talking about right now is what's called belief. Right? Is believing in a God that you cannot see and cannot understand and cannot know, that is infinite and beyond all things, is beyond grasp, right? So when they say they don't believe in God, it might be that that's the God they don't believe in, because that's where belief is even relevant. When it comes to, so to speak, believing in the God that fills the world, I would say most of them actually do believe in it. They might not call it God. They call it like the life force, right? Because it's not something that you can actually deny. And as we're going to soon see, in other words, what's the difference between a dead body and a living body is not something that anybody can come along and say there's no difference. You have to say this one has something in it that this one doesn't have. Now, if they want to call it the soul or some energy force or some chemical reaction, it doesn't matter what they want to call it. The reality is, okay, they might be disillusioned over the fact that they don't think it's God. They think it's the powers of nature. But the fact that they can see that there's a life force living inside of something is not subject to their belief or disbelief. It's a fact. And that's what I'm saying. Like, when they say, I don't believe in God, they can't mean that. They don't have to believe in the difference between a living body and a dead body. It's obvious. It's not even something that you would say, do you believe in that? Do you believe that you're wearing glasses right now? It's not the word belief does not go on such a thing. It's a fact. Now, whether they recognize that what they're seeing is God or not, that's a different story. But the reality that there's a life force enlivening everything, it's not even subject to debate. So when they say what they mean when they say they don't believe in God, is that they're actually aligning with they're not performing this positive mitzvah, which is to believe in God means to believe that there's something beyond what you can see. And beyond what can be seen, we're talking about my flesh, I can see God. That's not the mitzvah of belief. That's there's no mitzvah to believe that because you can see it. But the mitzvah to believe that there's infinity, which completely is unaccessible except for with your belief. The only thing that can actually align with the infinite God is something called belief. But knowledge or anything like that can never reach it. It's fair for them to say, I don't believe in such a thing. You know, that's why we have a commandment, because you have free choice. You have to dafka believe. And that's like an act of will. I will believe in such a thing that I cannot see and I know nothing about because I'm a believer. So to say that they don't believe there is not such a crazy thing because it is wild to believe in such a thing. You have to be mamash a believer to believe in such a thing. Anyway, so did you follow what I'm saying there?
Yeah, it makes more sense now.
Okay, so going back, what does it mean that we're not commanded to believe because it's obvious and we can see it? So he says, right, even though it's a translation of the word to see, you don't actually see God. And that's why also there they can call it energy, they can call it a life force, they can call it something else, because it's not, you don't actually see it as God. That's why it says, Haamanas Elokus. I see it with a translation of the word see. Nonetheless, it's pretty much like you can see it. This that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is enlivening the worlds inside. Because when you see something with the mind's eye, which is so clearly true to you, it's as though you see it with your physical eye, right? In other words, like the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, where do you see that, right? It's not anywhere, but it's like something true to me and obvious as day. That's called seeing it. Just like I'm seeing this cup in front of me. Okay, it's a slightly different word for seeing. Here we call it echzeh because it's like a translation of seeing because it's seeing with the mind's eye. But we call it a translation of seeing because it's practically the same thing as seeing something. When something is so true and obvious to you, we call it seeing.
Because right there.
It's right there, right? You can see it, even though it's not mamish right there, but it's right there.
I see.
And this type of like true obviousness is what Eov meant when he said, "For my flesh I can see God." Meaning, and this is what I was saying before, just like a person, it's very obvious, it's not something subject to debate, that you have a life force. Here he calls it the life of your soul. Maybe their doubters won't call it the soul, but they have to call it a life force. And it's an existence of a soul which is encloaked into your body, that enlivens it. And because we know the body does not live on its own. Because we have unfortunately plenty of evidence of a body that's not alive. When it's just a body, it's an inanimate object, just like flesh and bones. And he says, it's no different than the flesh and bones of a chicken that's in your pot, right? Unfortunately, and it's kind of gross, but a dead body is not alive to the point that it's no different. It's an inanimate object sitting. It could be sitting in your pot, right? So if it suddenly is not sitting in your pot, it's running around a chicken, or it's running around a man. It's obvious that there's something enlivening it, right? And even the greatest scientific doubters, they have no explanation for that. They have no explanation for understanding how suddenly something's alive and then it's dead. They can, and by the way, if there's anything scientifically, there's all this evidence now of afterlife and all kinds of things that people are figuring out with different experience that people had, with different drugs that people are taking. It's like there's clearly something that goes on with your existence, even when it's not connected to your body, right? So there is a spiritual soul that's connected to this otherwise piece of meat. And it's, what it is the spiritual life force which is invested into the blood, as it says in the pasuk, Hadam hu hanefesh, ki Hadam hu hanefesh, right? That the blood is the soul. That whatever it is, we also know that if you lose enough blood, it goes away. right? So somehow this blood, this unique, wondrous liquid that's inside of you, and it's warm and it's pumping through your whole body. It somehow is the secret to being the bridge between the spirit and the flesh. Explains in Chassidus, not the blood itself. It's like these sort of steam that comes out of the blood. It's called the spirit of the flesh. It connects with the physical of the spiritual. And there's some kind of a totally inexplicable bond between body and soul, which happens somewhere in the realm of the blood.
Wow.
V'im kein, hagam sheme'olam lo ra'a adam mahus hanefesh. Now, even though no one ever saw a soul, and in this, we're also just like those non-believers. In other words, like, show me the soul. I can't really show it to you. We're also like agreeing to that. Eichu mahi, what is this soul? No idea. We also don't have any idea. Im kol zen nis ames etzlo bar mitziyusa. Nonetheless, it's totally clear to me and you're atheist, that there is such a thing. Because it doesn't require belief. It's like a fact that glasses on your face. Right? It's living or it's dead. What's living inside of it? I don't know. Neither do you, but it is there. There's something there. We call that the mind's eye. Seeing something with the mind's eye. And that is a true, strong emes, just like the seeing with the eye. Just like no one's going to tell you there's no cup here, because I see it. No one's going to tell me there's no soul in the body, because I see it. It's not called re'iyah. It's called echzeh. It's called a chozeh, a translation of the word seeing, because you're only seeing, so to speak, that it's there. You don't know exactly what it is, but it's still as clear and true as seeing itself. And that's what it means. Echzeh elokam mamish. You can literally see God. Birosu kol ha'olam chai. In other words, just like I see your soul, so to speak, I can see the soul of the world, because the world is alive. And every creation in it, in accordance with its own little dimension, Lefi Archo, Halgalgalim, Misnananim, the planets are circulating. How is that? Right? Seemingly they would just be like dormant and dead if there wasn't something moving through them. And the Aretz Yesh Ba Koach HaTzomeach, the land is growing. Latzmeach Hasav Milanos, whereas these trees and these grasses, they're not just dead, dormant grasses, they're alive. And they're making fruits, and I see Bali Chaim and animals, Margishim, that can feel things, and also there's a soul inside of a man. So basically, just like you can see your own soul, you can see the soul of the world, the clouds moving through the sky, the oceans in flux, everything. The whole world, the whole world is like one big body, which is 500 year walk from one end to the other, as the Kabbalists put it. And if it was not for some life force inside of it, what we call mamali kolomim, it would be an inanimate object. Where does this life force come inside of every single thing? This is the Haamanas Elokus. Again, they might not want to call it that, but they can't say that it's not there. So they have to come up with some other name for it, right? But really, their name is not even as logical as calling it God, because they have no explanations to what it is either. Right? And this is the life force of godliness. That Hashem is enlivening it and enlightening it. And this, we'll conclude here because I know we've been a little bit over time. And this is what the sages meant when they said, Ma neshama mamaliyas haguf, kacha kadosh baruch hu mamaliyas olam. Right? The Midrash, the Tehillim, the sages had it all worked out in very simple statements. We didn't need all this Chassidus in those days. They could just say it as it is. They said, quote, just like the soul fills the body, so too Hashem fills the world. Very obvious. And that's the idea of mamali kolomim. And for this, there's no concept of belief because you can see it. L'chaim livracha.